Hi guys, welcome from Pax Europiana, the podcast about peace in Europe, and this one again about Ukraine. That's the Ukrainian dress. That's me as an Austrian calling for Austria and Ukraine to be united again in NATO. It's very important that Austria joins NATO, but also that Ukraine joins NATO and Kosovo and Bosnia and obviously also Moldova and Georgia. But clearly one day also Serbia should join, there is no doubt. But first of all, it's important that Ukraine and Austria, they are joining this great alliance, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, this great defensive alliance. But as I have outlined, it can only protect free Ukraine. That means basically, sadly, without the occupied parts. And that's obviously difficult, but the role model is the Western German NATO membership of 55. And here I would like to outline why this is also important, why actually the First Cold War was very much won, because the defeated nation, Germany, was then 10 years after the end of the Second World War integrated as a Western client state into NATO. That was unprecedented 10 years after the defeat. And it was very historic, and it laid the economic fundament, and the security fundament for the victory in the Cold War, because it broke down in the German border very much, and also Poland, obviously, Czech Republic, Hungary, many reasons. But the main differential was the economic differential between Western Germany and Eastern Germany. The same people performing so differently because of these very different economic systems, and this was undermining obviously the whole case for communism. It was very clear that even when you have the same people, when you have a different system, the results after 40 years is the one living in poverty and disaster, still in the 70s or 60s on prosperity level, and the Western Germans were part of Western world and of the free world and rich and successful. And this tore the fundament down of communism, obviously, very much. And this is now in the August. It's always a good time to remember the Baladon, the Hungarian lake, where the Western Germans were on holiday. They were crushing the border. They were opening the border to Austria on the Gate of Freedom. And it's time to go there to visit these famous sites. I visited in the historic, I think it was last year, when I was there, now 2019, and it was very special, obviously, the 30-year celebration. Good. Why I say all these things now at this moment and why they matter? Because if you followed my debates, we are now in the Second Cold War since 2008. Why we are in that one? It's of course connected with the tragic loss of Russia towards the KGB clique in the vital years of 89. In 98 to 2000, when basically with this kind of ruble crisis they manipulated and the huge money they stole with this Fimaco affair, siphoning off the IMF funds, and they were then gradually taking power in Russia and also gradually then in Ukraine. And the situation was dramatically, it was really dramatic loss for the free world, this victory against the market forces and against the center-right wing, against Nemtsov and against Gaidar in the Russian confrontation after Yeltsin. This was, of course, the start, but then it took some time to consolidate. There was also in the West this period of George Bush. He enlarged NATO. He then liberated Iraq and Afghanistan as a response to 9/11. And so the things went, and there was a really dynamic phase of the West, obviously controversial. And then came the pushback. The pushback is very important to understand the meaning of the great financial crisis, but also the significance of the Bucharest summit, of the Kosovo recognition as independent state, and also of the idea to bring Georgia and Ukraine into the fold of the West, into NATO. So what happened in this very crucial, pivotal year of 2008 was a lot of dynamic things, but it was the end of the Bush presidency, and he has already done unprecedented success with NATO enlargement towards Eastern Europe. 7 new countries, and laying the fundament also for Albania and for Croatia, so 9. That was unprecedented. So came the moment when obviously the moment was then for EU enlargement, obviously 2004, and Russia saw on all its fronts, because it's always important to see Russia, the world from the Russian perspective. Yeah, was Eastern Europe was gone towards NATO. Ukraine was the Orange Revolution and the Rose Revolution in Georgia. And so they felt like, we are losing everywhere, we are losing everywhere. In Iraq, that was a Russian client state. Yeah? In Afghanistan, a Russian, very important asset for Russia, obviously. In the whole history of since 73, they were really very active. Yeah? So for them, there was the time for the pushback. And in the ideologically world of the Russians, as they are educated, especially the KGB Russians, obviously the idea that the great financial crisis is the turning point was very logically. September 2008 was then obviously the point, okay, because like many of the Greens and also of the left in Europe and in the world, and many also of the nationalists, they never believed in capitalism, in the free market. They thought it's a fragile system which one day will anyhow have to break. And so similar like 29 led to this massive escalation in armament and ultimately to the World War II, because the big dictators, already present Stalin but also then Hitler, they were seeing this breakdown of the free market system as the normal consequence of the free market system. It was anyhow bound to fail, and they would replace it with their authoritarian answers from the left or from the right. Yeah. And this is exactly what many have seen in 2008 as well, especially when they're trained by the KGB or by communist China or anybody in that thinking, or they were from this extreme left or extreme right thinking we have also in Europe. And so they didn't trust that we will recover, and we did, yeah, also from the great financial crisis. But obviously then added this difficulty of the great financial crisis to this emergent second Cold War, where Russia, which had this petrol wealth, was then starting systematically to undo some of the arrangements and counter everything they could. And obviously Putin was handicapped because he couldn't run for the third term. He had to be prime minister. Medvedev was a bit on a short, kind of more conciliatory move. And Putin was fuming that he is not in power, using the opportunity of the great financial crisis. He did some things, but he could not fully escalate it. You know, the war in Georgia, yes, but you know, it was not the full revanchism was not on display. It really then entered with his third term, with 2012 then, and then he could launch out fully, and he did. Yeah. And obviously in the meantime there was, in their perspective, the loss of Libya additionally, and so then of course, you know, full scale had to go into, of course, against Mitt Romney in the US to influence the American GOP and make sure that the anti-Russian Romney is not winning. And then it went on, obviously, then with the whole Russian operation in the United States, the softening up of the political system of the main opponent, which ultimately led to the Trump elections in 2016. And similar operations were going on in Austria, in Italy, in Germany, with the AfD, in Austria with the populists, and with the left in Germany, obviously very much so, and in Italy with all these extreme right-wing parties, and in France obviously as well, and so on, because they think globally. But it is just one of the kind of chessboards they are thinking. You know, when you see from Moscow out, you have here the Western Front with the European Union and NATO. Then you have Turkey with the issue of the Bosporus. Then you have Iran. Then you have Afghanistan. Then you have China. Then you have the Korean front towards Japan. So this is the thinking they have, and they always had. And there is always the access to the warm water, and all these kind of fronts are then important for them. And so to create opposition to the West and to somehow deconstruct what Bush has managed in the 2000, that was the aim. And systematically it's going to happen now with the fall of Kabul and with the, of course, the control of Syria, of Western Syria by Assad and Putin. And obviously also with their proxy Iran and China and North Korea, the challenge is ongoing. And this additionally to this problematic situation of the West really having a self-confident issue, because we are undermined as well by the extreme Greens, by the green left, by the extreme populists, not all of them, but those who really fundamentally hate the free market economy and the market economy in general, the system we have. Yeah? Those who want to have a different system. And this is very fundamental. If you don't like property rights, democracy, markets, then you are outside of this kind of constitutional framework which we have, outside of what we have achieved for 200 years now since the American Revolution. And this is basically outside of the system, and they want to destroy the system. There is unfortunately these people as well in the Greens. There are some of them in the Liberals, in all parties, unfortunately. As Hayek famously said, there are those who dream of a new system to calculate only welfare, and everything must be calculated in CO2 and so on and so on. These are basically the enemies of the free world from within. I'm very much aware there is, of course, climate change, and it's man-made, but it's not the ultimate most important priority. The most important priority is strategic security, and it is the economic welfare of the people. That means a working market economy and providing the welfare for almost everybody, and a system to help everybody in case of need. And this is our system, which has brought unprecedented prosperity to the world, and it will continue, and we have to defend it. But in this kind of great financial crisis, and then these foreign policy crises which have translated, first of all the Greek financial crisis, then which was a consequence of the financial crisis, then obviously also then what we had, the Syrian civil war, very much helped by Russia, and also our lack of intervention in it. And this 2013, together with the withdrawal decisions from Iraq and from Afghanistan, the rise of ISIS and the rise of the Taliban again, and so on and so on. And then leading to the complete breakdown of Syria in 2015, to the great financial crisis, the Russian-supported Brexit, and also then that was 2016, the migration crisis 2014. I forgot, of course, the big war in Ukraine with the fall of and annexation of the Crimea, and of course of the Donbass war. And what was in 2013? I forgot. Now then was 2017, 21. Now the fall of Kabul. So we have a real big list of losses. Yeah. A lot of shocks when it comes. The climate shock is of course a big topic, but it's a minor shock when you compare it to the great financial crisis, the Greek debt crisis and the sovereign debt crisis of the southern European states. Then obviously the migration crisis, the Syrian civil war, the greatest human disaster in our generation. And then you have obviously Brexit as a result of all this. And you have also then 2017, 18 were then better years, 19 as well, 20 then Corona. So we had really quite a lot of shocks and crises in this decade, and this has shaken the fundamentum. And some people call really for a new system. And these double shocks, basically this one constant shocks in the economic system of the West, and then also the challenge from revanchist Russia and also rising China. This is of course a big challenge, and we have to somehow understand this challenge, and that's also why I make this video. But we have also then to lead to response to the challenge, and to understand that not everything is completely bleak, the picture. Because economically we have by far performed really very well. Especially America has really performed excellently. It's the freer system in Western Germany, and in most of the EU. The rebound after 2014 was not so significant, but there was also growth, and it was significant. And you see how much more employment was generated. And there was also significant economic growth, not as good as it could be, because we never reduced the taxes, we never fully supported what we did in the 2000s. We unfortunately went for the protectionist side, fighting against CETA with Canada, fighting against TTIP, fighting against Mercosur. We were blocking. In the 2000s we were open, and in the 10s we were then, as a response to the crisis, protectionist in trade and populism against the people, and then no more enlargement. So we blocked the Balkan enlargement, and we also somehow lacked the openness and trade. We got into the trade conflict with America and all this nonsense which hurts us very much. So what to do now? And is everything bleak? No, because dramatically what happened in 2014, and it's really dramatically obviously the Crimea annexation and the Donbass war, but it led to some very fundamental and important change. Because in this imperial overreach, which Russia in this kind of dynamic revanchist position of Putin 2012, 13, 14, what he did then, losing Ukraine, most of it, and gaining one broken two parts of it. Yeah? But it's a fundamentally very important geostrategic shift that Ukraine, which was in between the West and the East in this lost transition, because this Chernobyl and his Ruk party did not, like in the Baltic states, really take over power, but the nomenclatura took power in Ukraine after 94, not as extreme as in Belarus, but Moldova and much of the other Soviet Republic, and first of all Ukraine, was then managed by the nomenclatura until 2004 Orange Revolution, and that was also then managed backwards by Putin by 2010. But then came the moment of the Euromaidan revolution. And this is the historic shift where the revolution, first of all, with this ever more brutal escalation by the security forces, and then leading to this extreme violence on the 20th of February, but then as well by the attack of Russia in Crimea and in Donbass, leading to the full orientation of the Ukrainians towards the West. And given 100 years of brainwashing in a Soviet-Russian kind of world, this is very historic. It's the first time they really have a majority for NATO, they have a majority for the EU. And this is now consistent, and this is changing the world. That led obviously on the other side also for Russia getting more aggressive and wanting to stop them. But this transformation has happened now. The problem is then Russia can stop still the Western integration of Ukraine via its proxies like Austrian government, Hungary, Italy, partly France. And so what they do is basically, because they have lost 37 million of the Ukrainians, they have lost Ukraine forever, and free Ukraine, and they then intervene very hard to make sure that the European appeasement fractions is rejecting Ukraine fully and doesn't allow EU membership and NATO membership. And in this we are stuck since 2008 basically, in the same circle, but we have ever more moved Ukraine to the West, but we have constantly rejected Ukraine on the other side via the Russian influence and our own kind of confused perception of Ukraine. And that's the tragedy of Europe, and here it needs a strong American leadership to end this, but it also first of all needs a strong Ukrainian leadership to create facts. So what I say here is not, this famous Ukraine has to fight corruption. Yes, it always would be good, and much has happened already. It's the most digitalized government. EU has now recognized the digital COVID certificates, and this is meaningful. And in all other things, Ukraine is really enormously advanced now in digital transformation, much more than Germany and Austria. So that's really good, it's going. Corruption, obviously, much needs to be done still. But Ukraine needs to be self-imposing itself towards the European Union. Because to wait until the Germans say yes, or the French say yes, or the Italians, or the Hungarians, or the Bulgarians, or the Austrians, which are all very much influenced by Russia heavily. And it's different in Northern Europe. They are much more reluctant against Russian influence historically. And in Poland and in the Baltic states, they know Russia much better. But in this kind of soft underbelly of Europe, we have a lot of Russian influence in the countries I have already mentioned. So what Ukraine needs to do, and I explained it since I lived there in 2017, written it in many papers, is obviously to impose itself to Europe. And this is not uncommon, what basically non-allied client states of big powers have often done in history. Obviously, big powers don't want that, because they want to set the agenda. But it's Ukraine who has to set the agenda, and it's very logical, and I've explained it many times. It's the euro for Ukraine, to adopt the currency of Europe. Obviously, that is for some people a wild kind of a theory, and they have rejected and poked fun on me. But I repeat it, we have done that in the wars in the Balkans for Montenegro and for Kosovo. They have the currency. And of course, it's a restriction of sovereignty. Yes, you have then to ask for the monetary volume, and you must be integrated. It's of course not so easy like printing money and fooling inflation and devaluation and all this terrible circle Ukraine is since 2014 and in reality since 2008 permanently. It's time to get a grip, and it's time to stop all this negative economics, and it's also time to make the step towards Europe, which Europe is not ready to make, because normally Ukraine should have a long time already the EU potential candidate status and obviously the NATO map and then join. But it's not so easy because of this Russian influence in Italy, France, Germany, Hungary, Austria, Bulgaria, and some others. And others are maybe afraid, and Russia is threatening, and Russia is buying influence. So there is a massive operation here going on from Russia. So what Ukraine should do is to change the currency, because that any country can do by itself. Nobody can hinder Ukraine on that one. What is the hindrance? That you block the funding of the EU, it's anyhow not so much. Or that you put the credits under execution. I don't think so, that anybody will make such a decision in the European Union. So in reality, the currency is the tool Ukraine has. And obviously to have better governance and also to borderize the borders, and also make very clear that this is basically the Federal Republic of Ukraine, similar like the Federal Republic of Germany joining now the West. We have also in the EU Cyprus as a divided country. We have Germany as a divided country in NATO and the EU. So it's all with precedence. But the key is, and the tool to have, is the euro. That's why I call all the time for that. And that is also very important geostrategically, because now after the fall of Kabul, and we will see how the situation is going in Iraq and Syria, in Lebanon, but I will say that one crisis is often leading to the next. So the withdrawal decision of Afghanistan comes in a context. So there will be new dominoes to fall, and then the question is what to do with Ukraine. It's on the table. And here's the positive message again. In all this mess, as I have said many times, 15 years after the fall of Vietnam, South Vietnam, the West won the Cold War. And why? Because it's economically important. We have to win also this confrontation with Russia and China. Especially Russia is a more regressive. China is an economic challenge. And anyhow, it's contributing also to the GDP of the West. So it's less of a problem in this strategic sense. Russia is the main problem, and here we have to win economically. So Ukraine must be 3 times as rich as Russia. That's not so easy. That's only possible inside the EU, inside the euro, inside NATO. So again, the euro is here the key, and also Ukraine is an important key pivotal place for the West to be successful, because it has certain economic and it's also a big country simply. It's not exactly as big as Western Germany in relation to the Europe in the 1950s, obviously, but it's at least half as big, and it is significant. And together with the Western Balkans, it's again, and with Georgia and Moldova, all together, it's 67 million people. So that's about like Western Germany in the Cold War. So ultimately, this is a very important resource, the people, and also everything they bring and all the assets they have. And to be in the EU, NATO and in the euro is making then the West so strong again that we can win this confrontation. And we can win it because we in the EU are already 3 times richer than the euro and than the Russians. We are at 35 and they are at about 10,000 euros around. So ultimately, when the Ukraine and all the Balkan countries come to our level in our system, that will be very meaningful to show the prosperity differential along the Russian-European border and going right through Ukraine ultimately now. That's sad, but it goes. And that it must be 3 times richer than Russia. And that we have to achieve. And the only way to achieve it and to win peacefully this Cold War, because the Second Cold War we can also not win with any kind of reconquista, nuclear arms or Armageddons. No, that is all not to be. Luckily, we want to have peace. It's also this podcast piece. And so economically, the confrontation must be one. That means that Western Europe must reduce its tax rates, it must open up, it must end this protectionism and populism, and must be more open towards the world with free trade agreements with Mercosur, with TTIP, with African Union, with Uzbekistan, with India, with Pakistan, with the Gulf Cooperation Council that I all mentioned already, and also with ASEAN, yes, and that's the most important, but also to have pan-European labor market together with Ukraine, to enlarge the Eurozone and to be more united in Europe, and also more integrated in terms of common defense and all the things we anyhow know all of this. Yeah? It's all long overdue. But this crisis decade and this kind of double challenge of the great financial crisis until now, with these multiple crises internally and economically, and also the strategic challenge of revanchist Russia, we have to answer now with more unity between the US and the EU, with the EU joining NATO, and also then with Ukraine in the European Union, and obviously all Balkans, and obviously Georgia and Moldova. And so then we can more united as the free world, with NAFTA, it's now called from Mexico to Canada, USMCA, and with also EFTA, and with Turkey, and with all NATO here, also the British united economically, together also with all our free trade agreements with Africa and Mercosur and Japan and ASEAN in the future as well. And so to be so economically successful in the 2020s after Corona, with also a more open economy. And yes, we have also to do climate change. Yes, we have to decarbonize. But first of all, decarbonize us from the Russian gas, from the Russian petrol, from the Russian coal. And not we stop coal, we stop petrol, we stop gas in order to buy more from Russia because it's then cheaper and Russia has more money. No, make a zero phase out of Russian coal, Russian uranium as well, Russian gas and Russian petrol. Yeah, that's very good by 2030. And phase it out, phase it out completely. Starve the beast. Yeah? Repeat the oil glut of 1986. Yeah? That was one of the pillars of the victory of the Cold War. And make sure that Russia feels the heat, because budgetary we can really starve them. And that's very good. And then what we also need to do is obviously to get Ukraine into the EU, NATO and the Euro. And it starts with Ukraine. And when Ukraine doesn't understand it, and I make so many videos about it, and then I'm very clear, but unfortunately the Ukrainians, they don't do the big reforms, they don't do the 10% tax rate, they don't do the Euroization of Ukraine, they don't open the labor market, the land market, the capital market fully to the European Union. It's a bit confusing as well. What is the kind of thinking? I think Zelensky and his team, they think in kind of a Soviet world, and in kind of, they are a big power of the world. Obviously, they are very important as an additional puzzle piece inside the West, but not as an independent power by themselves or whatever, a kind of independent entity in between Russia and the EU and NATO. That's not the idea. But fully integrated, that makes sense. That makes things from economics, strategically, and that's very important for the West and for the free world. And that's with now fall of Kabul plus 15, we are then, let's say, in 2040, and that's the timeline it takes for the next fall of Russia. They will have their kind of succession struggle after authoritarian Putin in the 2030s, and they will be paralyzed. And then it's also the moment where Crimea and Donbass can return, and maybe also we will see the fall of the Russian Empire. That is actually what we should work for, and what I think will be happening in the 2040s if we are economically successful. If we end protectionism and populism, start with lower taxes, focus on SMEs, solve all these kind of minor irregularities in the Western systems. I have made this list of 50 things to do for the new leadership in America and in the EU in 2019-20. They have not done it, but ultimately that's important, from recognition of Kosovo towards and all the things attached to it, towards OECD and OSZE membership, towards all the NATO enlargement, Eurozone enlargement, Schengen enlargement, CEFTA enlargement, and all the things I have already talked about it. Anyhow, that's the way for success. I wish you now, because I was told not to make videos longer than half an hour, but that's my video of the day. Mr. Zelensky, all the best in the White House, but I think there will be not a big result now with all the attention in Kabul and in the tragedy of the fall. So what is coming up, I'm quite confident, is now to focus on Ukraine directly. And here I call for the Euro for Ukraine. Mr. Zelensky, that you can do yourself and just do it. Don't wait for anybody, because that's the best way. And this will make the West successful again. And it will be the leadership we need. And it will lead to NATO and EU membership. And it will lead also to a bit of a confrontation with Russia additionally. But that will also lead then to more unity of the West. And that's exactly how we have to do it. So learn about Western German history and about EU unification history. We also did the Euro before we did the political union. We did Maastricht before we did Nizza and all the other treaties of our union. And so the logic is very clear. And Ukraine, please adopt the Euro. And by the way, same for Albania, same for Georgia, Moldova, for Macedonia, Bosnia, and ultimately for Serbia then as well, as a prize for recognition of Kosovo. Because it's a wonderful currency, by the way. It will also create and store value much better. And it's a really good thing to have. And why to have the hryvnia? It's anyhow not working very well. Good. So far, for now, more to come. Best regards from Pax Europiana. Please give me a like on my YouTube. And also please give me check out my podcast. I do also daily podcast about peace and prosperity. Thanks a lot. All the best. Bye.